Mmm. Yum, yum. Oh, hey everybody. I'm here today to talk to you about 1922's Nosferatu, directed by F.W. Murnau. Hopefully I'm saying that right, which is an adaptation of Bram Stoker's Dracula. This is an adaptation of that. This is a German adaptation of this novel, and this is actually a very close and near and dear adaptation of this novel. However, I have not read this. It's been on my shelf for, I don't know, ages, kind of just like the age of Dracula or Nosferatu, Count Orlok in this film. So let me tell you a little bit about Nosferatu. I'm going to tell you just brief parts of the summary, some of the things I liked about this film, and some of the cons that I've had of this film, and really give you my overall thoughts. So if you're very familiar with the world of Dracula, or at least with the novel, or have seen any of the adaptations, it's fairly close to the adaptations of all these things. It starts off with Thomas and Ellen in this fictional German town they live in, and it's in the early 1800s. And Thomas's boss, who's very creepy himself, kind of like Count Orlok's character, which we'll get to in a second, sends him off to meet this new client in Transylvania, and that's Count Orlok. Now Thomas sends his goodbyes to Ellen and is really excited to go on this journey, but also kind of nervous. Thomas travels to Transylvania and he meets some of the locals there, and he is warned that there's werewolves out and prowling, and this is actually Count Orlok himself, pretty much being this predator and seeking his prey. It's a very visceral and also very symbolic way of calling out unnatural things and also nature as well. I find that very fascinating. However, let's get back to the story. He eventually heads to the castle. He gets picked up, Count Orlok, I'm fairly certain himself, and in this buggy and carriage, and it moves at an unnatural speed, and it seems really insane because that just shows you the camera work at the time in the 1920s, especially the early 22. They didn't really have too many special effects, so they had to pretty much speed up the camera reel, the effect making it so the buggy is going super fast, and that actually is one aspect of this film that I'll talk about in a little bit later as well, with some movements that Count Orlok also does. And it's really interesting, and I find that very fascinating, especially for the time period it was made in. So he gets to the castle. Count Orlok talks about living in an apartment flat in Germany next to Thomas and Ellen, kind of near where his boss wants him to go. As you can probably guess, he has other plans. He wants to get close to Ellen and also just get out of Transylvania and feed on as many people as you can. So that's all I really want to talk about in the summary, because it really just unfolds kind of like Dracula in a sense, where lots of craziness ensues. There's lots of blood. There's also a lot of traveling overseas, trying to get to Germany and trying to get there. Count Orlok's trying to get there himself. Well, whereas Thomas is under his spell, he's been bit in the night and pretty much is weakened by this fact. And Van Helsing pops in Germany and tries to stop the monster, as there's a spell cast over one of Ellen's friends. If you've seen a lot of these kind of Dracula films, even Dracula Dead and Loving It, you'll understand what I'm talking about. So let me move on to some of the pros, and then I'll talk about some of the cons. So some of the pros of this film is this is, to me, one of the most faithful adaptations of the book in a different sense. Obviously it's German, Count Orlok is Count Dracula. There's different characters involved as well, and I think that's really interesting. And honestly, to me, this is actually better than 1931's Dracula, which is the thing that followed after this in America. Now, I'm not going to say Bela Lugosi is a fantastic actor and also portrayed Dracula in a very iconic sense, and I actually think that he did a fantastic job of playing Count Dracula. However, to me, this film seemed like it flowed a little bit better. It kept me more intrigued and interested, whereas the other film did not as much. However, I'm not knocking 1931's Dracula. That is a masterpiece on its own. This is I prefer this film over that one. Alright, so let me talk about some of the aesthetics. So the music in this film, because it's a silent film, actually it really works for the film, and I think it really works for the landscape pieces that they really set up a lot of practical movements and also practical things and sound effects that really occur for this film. And when I say sound effects, I'm talking about just, obviously it's a silent film, I'm talking about the music itself. The score is gorgeous, and I actually think it really complements the film well. Now, I was talking a little bit about the landscape. The landscape is like in this, I don't know where this was filmed. I'm assuming Germany and some other film locations because it's a German film. However, this is post-World War I Germany, so I don't know where they found a lot of this gorgeous gorgeous landscape, and also I can tell with the German forest that it was dense and thick, and I can tell where a lot of these monster tales come in, where there's Dracula, there's werewolves, you know, there's a lot of darkness in these wilderness. And I think that's really cool that they played on that. There was a beach scene in particular that I thought was gorgeous. That reminds me, the set designs in this film were really, really well done. It seems like features nowadays don't set up scenes as much as they should. Now there's a couple of obviously people, directors that actually do this really, really well. Paul Thomas Anderson, P.T. Anderson, and Quentin Tarantino come to my mind. However, a lot of people don't focus on the setting of a place, and they don't really think of the set design as much. I've seen a lot of films lately, and I couldn't recall very much from them. Even like just the set locations and the design. I think there needs to be a lot more focus on practical aspects of that. And actually, that's what I like about this film, is they actually add a lot of practical material involved, and also really have really thoughtful set designs. A lot of it has double meaning, and a lot of them, it kind of reminds me of Seventh Seal a little bit. When I'm saying reminds me of the Seventh Seal, this predates Seventh Seal, but there's some scenes that really I could tell that Seventh Seal probably took some liberties from Nosferatu, and I thought that was really, really interesting and intriguing. Another thing I want to talk about is some of the character development. Some of the character designs were really interesting, and I think Count Orlok's character and Van Helsing's character and even Thomas himself all portrayed themselves really, really well. Especially Nosferatu, obviously. This is an iconic character. You have this iconic scene where he's encroaching on Ellen and everyone, and this in the ship when he is initially getting out of his coffin, where Thomas sees him get out of his coffin. A lot of really interesting and intriguing set designs here, and also just character. It doesn't even have to speak, it just has to be present, and that's what I like about this film. Also, Van Helsing, there's actually a really cool scene with Van Helsing that I thought was actually really interesting for the time period, especially with the time period that was happening. There was a science boom in the early 1900s, and they looked under a microscope, and the shot was really cool for the time period, and I thought this is kind of ahead of its day. There was a parasite that attacks this organism and pretty much consumed it. It portrayed that predator-prey. There was a dominant person, aka a vampire, taking over this victim and pretty much making it its own. Another thing is, I wanted to talk a little bit about how the camera work was really, really well done. I talked a little bit about the horse and buggy. There's another scene where Count Orlok is actually moving all of his coffins, how he can move to Germany and actually get to this flat. And Thomas is watching, in pretty much like he's flabbergasted that Count Orlok is moving all these coffins so fast and also by himself. And it seemed really interesting how the camera sped up and just like really show that supernatural effect, just like with the carriage. I thought that was really interesting as well, especially when he came up and rose. Like I did early on in this video, I did really poorly at it, but I did that. There's also some other elements in this film that I probably can't even think of that I'm not touching on. Alright, so now let me talk about a couple of the cons. There's only a few. And those cons are sometimes in the music. It didn't really fit, but what do I know? Obviously I'm in 2017. Some of the music didn't seem to fit the certain parts of the movie, and I thought that was like really strange and took me out a little bit. Another thing was that this is for its time period. Remember, you have to think about the context of the time period. This is a little silly nowadays. Some of the effects, obviously some of the dialogue is really silly. When I say dialogue, it's black and white, it's silent, so it's showing you cards where the dialogue is taking place. But I really enjoyed that aspect as well. So there really isn't much cons in this film. I thought this really holds up to today, and I think this wouldn't bore many people. So what do I give this film? I give this movie a 5 out of 5. This is a classic film. You must own this movie, or at least see it in some capacity. Definitely go watch this film if you want to get an understanding of how horror has developed today and a lot of the effects that occurred both on the camera and also just in general and natural cultural spheres. You can see how much influence Nosferatu is given. Definitely want to hear your thoughts down below. I've done some silly things, and you can comment on that, or you can just comment on the film itself. So make sure to give me a like, comment below, and don't forget to share, and also subscribe. And I'll see you next time. I'm not jonesing around.